All right, hello everybody. My name's Will, and this is my presentation on Gestalt therapy. Real quick, the definition of the word Gestalt is a German word that refers to a whole that is different than the sum of its parts. And this is how the therapist approaches the client in Gestalt therapy. We are looking at the entire client and how they interact with their environment, not just certain emotions or behaviors. We're looking at the whole client. And I'll move on. So, brief history. It was founded by Fritz Perls in the 1940s. Um, he was very famous for his public demonstrations. He was kind of a polarizing figure, and he has a lot to do with Gestalt having this sort of dramatic, confrontational stereotype. The other big names are Irving and Miriam Polster, who tried to kind of undo that reputation. They were a bit more empathetic in their approach. And then Gestalt reached its peak in the 70s and 80s before declining. A lot of ideas and concepts got absorbed into other methods of therapy, but true Gestalt nowadays is very rare. So the three basic guiding principles is the importance of personal responsibility, which is normal therapy stuff, obviously, but there's a big accountability component to it. They're big on not blaming others or their situation. It's all about taking accountability for your own life. Authenticity, self-acceptance are that's another big concept. They're real heavy on being yourself and knowing who that is. And they're also big on living in the moment, which is experiencing reality in that moment, how it really is. And to tie on to that, when we are experiencing reality, not concerned with like trauma or anxieties or anything like that, we call that contact. And another thing about contact is we have to be our authentic self and we have to be fully focused and have full energy to make contact with our surroundings. Something that gets in the way of making contact with our environment are boundary phenomena. These are coping mechanisms and they sort of obscure what's really happening around us because too much contact can be overwhelming. So they provide a benefit in that we do not always want to be tuned in all the time to what's going on, but if we're not tuned in at all, then we stagnate. Another big concept is the paradoxical theory of change, which is essentially the more we try to be someone that we're not, the more we stay the same, which again is stagnation. Um, and the idea that we get tied up in the person that we should or we want to be rather than who we really are in the present and focusing on that person instead. So, same concepts. The main goal of Gestalt therapy is awareness, which is we want the client to be aware of themselves, aware of their environment, and how they interact with that environment. And to be able to do that, kind of a sub goal, re-owning the self, like I've been talking about. This is just identifying the parts of ourselves, our personalities that we don't like. We try to change them, we avoid them, we repress them. We want to identify those, reintegrate those into our personality, and that way we can be our true selves. And then resolving unfinished business is basically just working through trauma, but Gestalt goes about it in a very intense way. So, talking about the therapeutic relationship, the role of the therapist varies. It really depends on who you ask. Some are very hands on, some are very hands off. Overall, they're more hands off than a typical therapist. A lot of them like to consider themselves as a catalyst, as in they won't make conjecture or inferences to the client directly, but they will try to put the client in a position where they can make those connections about themselves. themselves. Um, So that's what we mean talking about a catalyst. And then importance of the relationship. A huge amount of trust is required, especially when we're working through that unfinished business, or in other words, trauma. Things can get very, very intense. So you need a lot of trust for that to work. One of the ways a Gestalt therapist will try to help their clients is through the use of experiments. These are almost like a prompt you would get out of an improv class. They're creative. A lot of the times, the therapist is just inventing them on the fly, and these are just to increase the client's awareness of their own mental processes, feelings, behaviors, desires. And these experiments can look like anything, but one of the ways which is to say, one of the archetypes of an experiment is the reversal experiment, where we have a client who displays a negative pattern of behavior associated with contact disruptions. Could be shyness, people pleasing, anything like that. The therapist will identify this trait and then have the client act out in that session what it would be like to have the opposite personality trait. So I just wrote this little fan fiction thing here. We can see that the client has conflict issues. They can't initiate contact, and they can't express themselves. So we have the therapist having the client to pretend to be someone who is very, how should I say, confrontational. Um, and through acting out as this confrontational personality trait, the client gets a sense of catharsis and they get experiential learning. So by acting out during the session what it would be like to be confrontational, they can use that experience and analyze it and hopefully be able to integrate parts of that trait into their own lives. For example, our client here, by acting out being confrontational to her therapist, she can then attempt to be confrontational in her real life and express herself and get the things that she needs. Another technique is a speech modification. This is acknowledging specific patterns of language by the client that reduce their individuality, validity of their experience, their control over the present. This can be like using impersonal expressions like "it's so hard to get a job," using the phrase "I can't," vague qualifiers like "I guess," "I suppose," and asking questions instead of statements. The therapist will have the client re-speak phrases to them that they have just spoken, but they will replace this impersonal language with personal, empowering language, and this helps them get a sense of accountability and analyze how they detach themselves from their own experiences and capabilities. So right here, I wrote another fan fiction. You can see right here, we got an older dude. He's lonely. He's just getting divorced. And you can see right here, he says, "It's especially difficult when you are an old man and women won't even glance in your direction." And we can see right here, he says, "I can't go back to school." Then the therapist has him repeat what he just said, but try to use personal language. And then we have right here, I made this small little confrontation. His therapist asks him, "You can't go back to school or you won't go back to school." Which sounds kind of silly, but that is a big thing in Gestalt. Having clients say, "I won't" instead of "I can't," because that implies a sense of accountability and responsibility for the client's own situation and what they can do about it. And probably the most famous technique we'll see in Gestalt is the empty chair experiment, and this is used a lot to work through unfinished business or relive trauma. So the client or the therapist will identify trauma, and who it's related to, and then we'll have the client imagine the person that memory is associated with sitting in an empty chair, and then the therapist will have the client speak to them out loud. and try to bring these negative emotions to the forefront and try to make them as intense as possible. And then that way the client can sort of explore those feelings and analyze them rather than living in the shadow of the trauma which has been affecting them. So I made this little fan fiction again. We can see right here he has, whoop, my mistake. He has issues with the loss of his father. So the therapist has him imagine his dead father in the empty chair. The client says his piece to the imaginary father sitting in the chair, and by doing this again, he is able to analyze those feelings that he has about his father that he normally would ignore, but are definitely still very present and affecting him in his life. And by being able to analyze it, he has a better shot of taking the actions and having the wherewithal to work through that trauma. We're going to apply this real quick to Mavesh, assuming we're all familiar with the details. A Gestalt therapist would recognize that she considers herself very American and she's trying to fit into a culture that she doesn't identify with. We would call that would fall under the paradoxical theory of change. She can't grow if she's trying to be someone she's not. And the fact that she doesn't want to alienate her parents and is afraid of their anger, disappointment, loss of respect, etc., we would consider this a confluent boundary disturbance. So, because she's afraid of this conflict, she can't see the situation for what it really is and the true gravity of the consequences that could be affecting her. So the goal of for Mavesh would be for her to become aware of her own accountability and her power to make decisions in her own life, and that living for other people prevents us from living our own lives meaningfully, or in other words, trying to make her parents happy rather than focused on making herself happy. And they would go about this, try to help her by bring that anxiety she has to the surface, make that anxiety as intense as possible, explore that feeling, and then they might even do some role play. Obviously, the therapist would play the role of her dad or her parents, and she would work through that, trying to break the news that she's getting married to the man she actually loves. And that way she could take that experience with her, she can be more comfortable with that idea, and so forth. Contributions, experiment using spontaneous creative methods to promote experiential learning rather than static exercises which remain the same and are supposed to have an intended expected effect. It has that a visceral approach to dealing with trauma we just talked about, really bringing those negative feelings to the forefront and working through them that way. And the holistic approach and emphasis on reowning the self have been found very effective with bicultural clients or anyone who suffers from identity issues. So the main limitation I'd say right here, there is not a lot of scientific data saying that this works. So at least in isolation. So that is why we don't see a lot of full-on Gestalt therapy nowadays. And if you're going to use those techniques to bring those strong emotions, you have to know what you're doing. Otherwise, that could be very damaging. And Fritz Perls was honestly famous for doing that. Not a lot of closure in his public demonstrations. And another really funny reason is that if a therapist is not in tune with themselves, there is a propensity to try to impress the client, and we don't want that. And also, Fritz Perls was kind of a jerk. Do with that information what you will. Hopefully, I didn't gloss over too much, but thank you for listening.